Hi everybody, I'm Sam Nielson. Welcome to my presentation on breaking artist block with emergent design. I'm a concept artist and illustrator, so most of the things I'm going to talk about in this are going to relate to using emergent design principles and processes in order to overcome art block in a direction that skews towards solving problems for illustration and concept art. But I think that regardless as to your specific field, if you are ever plagued with artist block, these techniques might also be useful for you. Art block, it always looms there in the distance for every artist, sometimes a lot closer. Some of you deal with it frequently. Some of you are knowing that it's somewhere around the corner eventually, and you're just scared of the day when it's finally going to come. I had an interesting experience this summer. Right as I agreed to do this presentation on solving art block, I actually had the worst case of art block that I've ever had. And for weeks and weeks, I couldn't create anything. I was doing client work and I was fine during the client work, but anytime that I sat down to do my own work, nothing. I couldn't do anything. And it was a great test of the skills that I'm going to be talking about today. I've discovered in my reading and my studies and my personal experience that art block is usually caused by one of three things. First of all, it's caused by not having enough input or the right kind of input. And when I say input, we'll define that more in a second, but it means that you're not taking in the right type of stuff in order to have a good output. Second of all, you don't have anything to say. This means that deep in your heart, the inner artist cannot express anything because there isn't anything to express. And then the third one is fear of poor performance. So there's antidotes to this. They work incredibly well. Use them even together, even if you don't know what the cause is. If you use all three of these, you're going to overcome basically any art block you're going to face. So first of all, do studies of everything and anything. This is actually how I overcame the art block this summer that I had that was so persistent and so strong. I knew the input was important. What I didn't realize was just how important studies are. When I was trying to find other influences and other things that were exciting to me, nothing was really translating across. It wasn't making a difference in my art block, wasn't going away. And it wasn't until I finally realized that I needed to actually be doing studies, and it was almost within a day or two that the art block just completely opened up and I was able to work again on my own personal stuff. As soon as I started doing studies, I was doing figure drawings and gesture studies and studies of animals and structural studies and a bunch of different things like that, kind of in a concentrated period. And pretty quickly it just lifted. Second, live your life a little. Sometimes art block comes because you are not doing anything. You're just being an artist and that's it. And working in a lab or at your desk or even just hunched over an iPad all the time is not healthy for your artistic life. You need to go outside. Go visit a city that's interesting. Go outside and spend some time in nature. Go meet some interesting people and get to know them, talk to them. Just live your life a little bit, do something exciting, and you will find afterward you will have just this desire deep in you to express some of what it was that you observed while you were living your life. Third, you want to give yourself permission to suck, to be a terrible artist. And this is what the majority of today's presentation is going to be about, is how do you give yourself permission to suck? How do you give yourself permission to create terrible work? Now some of you are thinking, wait a second, Sam, I didn't come here to learn how to be a bad artist. But that's not the point. The point of giving yourself permission to suck, to create terrible work for a little while, this is the key to breaking art block and to creating good work. But the goal cannot be to create good work from the front. You've got to give yourself emotionally, mentally, if you have to actually say it to yourself in the mirror 10 times, it's okay to suck. And tell yourself until you believe it, because that's going to be the key to you actually starting to create good work again after you kind of power through the suckiness. Let's talk about the theory behind why that happens, giving yourself permission to do poor work or to be a terrible artist. Why does it work? Well, your creative brain, it has two parts. In the past, this has been described as the left brain, right brain thing, which has been debunked. But I've found that in terms of the inner dialogue that you have with yourself, that this concept is still true, that one part of your brain is the creator. It's this mad little genius, this mad scientist, this inner child, this thing that just wants to create and just explore and have fun. And then you've got another part of your brain, which is the editor. The editor increases in its power and ability the longer you live, and the more experience you have, the more your abilities increase. But the editor is this critical professor, this intelligent being, this part of yourself that will cut things apart and show you how everything is wrong. And at times that can be very useful, but it can be absolutely destructive to your little inner creator. And the best way to visualize this is to imagine that your inner creator, your mad scientist, is actually a little bit terrified of judgment and will just close up completely if you're not careful. The reality is this: your inner creator can't create when the editor is talking, or even when you know it's watching. Now, sometimes it works and you can actually have both parts of your brain working at the same time. But I found that usually when I'm able to get both working at the same time, I'm actually changing off between the two. I can't actually create while the editor is talking or while it's watching. And so the key in doing well is actually getting the inner creator to be set free and shut down the editor. Now, every artist deals with this struggle in some way or another. I would, just in my experience, every artist is dealing with it even when they are doing fine. There's some part of them that isn't performing as well as they ought to because they are dealing with this inner struggle of either over criticism from the editor, or they aren't able to balance the creator and the editor, and they're able to shut down the editor completely, and they never actually fix the stuff that they're doing. And today we're going to talk about how to manage both of those things. So Adobe Fresco is an awesome tool. There's a couple of things process-wise that I want to show you today that actually do a really good job of allowing your inner creator, that inner child that loves to just create and create and create, to just go crazy. And part of it is actually tying back to your inner child. So let's talk a little bit about the technique of how you're going to use Adobe Fresco. So first of all, I like to work with a square canvas. It's important to use a square canvas because when you're allowing the design to emerge on the fly, you don't want to have compositional constraints. The square canvas allows you to discover what the composition should be later down the line. Second of all, I really like to use the oil paint brushes in Adobe Fresco. The way that they push paint around reminds me of finger painting as a kid. And just the way that you smudge things around and let the mess happen a little bit and then try to find something fun in the mess. So usually I'll fill in the whole image with that paint, and then I like to create a little bit of variety around. I like to create some variety in value and some variety in temperature. And you'll see that I'm pushing things around. Sometimes I'm laying on the paint a bit thick, but I'm always blending it. I'm trying to get rid of edges during this first phase, trying to make it so that the image reads almost as just this undulating sea of color and value, something that ends up forming a nice basis of the thing that I am going to be painting. And I usually start really dark. And this is basically the method as I'll be showing it to you today, is that you start with very vague sort of paint strokes, and then you start to pick colors that are slightly different from the rest, and you start to smudge things around, lay down that paint a little bit, smudge things around, lay down that paint, and then you look at what you're creating and ask in your head, ask your creator, what do you see? What does this thing start to look like? And then when you have an idea, you start chasing that idea. And if you don't have an idea, you keep painting until that idea comes. And I found that eventually either some limbs of a character start to emerge, or some environmental element starts to emerge. And by the way, it's totally fine to have something in mind when you start this process. You don't need to go in totally blind. But as you can see, fairly quickly, and usually I've found within 15 to 20 minutes, I can tell whether I've got an idea that is worth pursuing or not. And this just goes so quickly. It's a great technique. Let's talk a little bit about how to make it work for you and not work against you as you try to create. So let's talk about some of the things you can do while you're working with this oil painting tool in Adobe Fresco that will help you to turn off your internal editor and just allow you to create. So first of all, your mindset needs to be to doodle, not draw. I will give a warning that while using this process is a painting process, it is like drawing. It's very much like drawing. And what you need to remember is that once you get into the drawing mode, it's really easy to start thinking about lines, and you're not really doing that. You're just letting stuff emerge, and so let it be soft and let it be smudgy, and don't try to push it too fast anywhere. And you're just letting the paint kind of do its thing. This technique will leverage any drawing skills that you have, but it also is a little bit more forgiving than drawing is if you do have drawing issues that you're still trying to work through. So as you're working, doodle, don't draw. Wash colors around, don't paint. Second, work big to small. I try to stay zoomed out and just work with the biggest brush that I can. I work on a 3000 by 3000 canvas, but you can work smaller. Just use the biggest tool possible for the job at any given time. Don't scale that brush down. Don't zoom in until you feel that it's appropriate to start getting into detail, until you actually know what you need to do down there into those lower resolution areas. I mentioned this earlier to start dark, but it's worth noting that it's okay if your shadows blend together. You can let the local colors and local values emerge organically from the painting instead of trying to paint in local values and local colors for everything when you start. Let the shadows all be brown at the start. And then later, if something isn't working as having a brown shadow, you can easily adjust it. It does tend to give the emotional quality of your piece a little bit more of an atmospheric and sort of smudgy, painterly, even sometimes slightly more serious quality if you're trying to go for something lighter, but you can easily adjust that later. Just start by letting all of your shadows blend together. Next, let accidents happen. Try to stop acting. Don't just make your focus be on making decisions, but react as you push paint in there and see what comes out of it. Don't go straight to vibrant colors. This is one of the things that hurts people the most when I've suggested that they try this method, is that they just start pulling in really strong color. Keep the colors desaturated. Try to keep the painting overall muted until something interesting starts emerging and you start to know where that story's going. Then you can push it. And when you do push it, really push it, because otherwise your painting ends up being very muted. So there might be a couple of colors that you really push strong and then everything else stays muted. That's exactly the way you want your paintings to be. Don't rush into detail. I mentioned using the biggest tool possible, but I think sometimes you'll think you know what the painting should be and you'll want to zoom in and get really close and start to noodle in those details. It's going to hurt you more than help you if you start putting detail everywhere. Instead, pick a couple of hero spots, some parts of the painting that you feel are going to do the best, that are going to show off the story and the thing that you're trying to create the best. Those are your hero spots, and those are the ones you put detail in. And then you let the other parts, the sort of smudgy, smoky parts of the painting, evoke the rest of the detail. You don't actually want to paint everything. This type of painting should go very, very quickly. You should be going from the beginning of a painting to the end of a painting within, at the most, an hour to an hour and a half. You should never be spending all day on one of these paintings. And next, don't make yourself make that decision yet. There's a lot of times when you'll be faced with a decision as you're working, and trying to make decisions turns on your internal editor. Keep the internal editor off and just kick the decision down the road if you can. And if you do have to make a decision, try to make the decision be more of a gut feeling than a logical decision. Usually as you get into the end of the painting, that's the time when you start making logical decisions. But early in the painting, just don't make yourself make that decision yet. You don't necessarily want your forms to be over-defined in this style either. You want to keep your light shapes and your shadow shapes connected. You don't want to have everything separated. You don't need the nose to be separated from the face in every particular. You only need detail specifically where you need it, and let those shadow shapes unify everything rather than pull things apart. Let the viewer's imagination do the work. You don't actually need to paint every part of this painting. Let the darkness that you started the painting from, that smokiness, suggest things so that their imagination can fill in a lot of those stuff for you. I found, generally speaking, in this method, it's actually way easier to paint cool lights with a warm shadow than it is to do a warm light with a cool shadow. So you can start with a cool color, that's totally fine. But when you start defining things and pushing your character or your environment piece or your prop or whatever it is that you've decided to paint, and you want to start applying lighting to it, it will just go much faster and much easier if you lean cooler in color towards where the light sources are, rather than skewing everything warmer. And be consistent. Whatever you decide, whether it's warmer or cooler, just be consistent through the rest of the piece. I've found that duplicating your image is really, really valuable. And this is something that I've found even to help me overcome some of the pitfalls, which we'll talk more about later. Because duplicating your image will allow you to go and explore instead of feeling like you might possibly lose something good that was happening originally, especially when you're trying something daring. Go and duplicate that image, and then you can go explore that thing. And if it doesn't work out, you have the previous version that you can jump back to. And then finally, get the generic, the boring, the stereotypical, the bad out first. Don't worry about whether you're putting out something bad. In fact, deliberately try to put out the bad thing. Think to yourself, what is the most stupid version of this thing that I'm designing possible? Because once you get those things out in front of you, you can start reacting to them and start making good decisions instead of having those things in the back of your consciousness interfering with the thing that you're trying to create. I think it's worth noting that this is very, very difficult, what I'm describing to you. It's very difficult to tell yourself, to train yourself, to fool yourself into saying, whatever I make is okay, when you know that an art director or the social media followers or whatever else is going to disagree with you. But you have to tell yourself anyway. You have to tell yourself anyway, whatever I make is fine. And that's part of the point of it being just 15-minute paintings, 20-minute paintings, 30-minute paintings, is because in the end, if you have to throw that thing away, there's no real thing lost. You're not going to have too much heartburn over that. So go ahead and throw it out. Trust yourself. Let the process iron out the problems. Don't feel like you need to be solving everything completely right away. And later, when you need it, you'll wake up your internal editor and you'll be able to fix the problems. I've found that it's very rare that one of these emergent paintings actually ever hits the level of quality that I would just put it in my portfolio when I'm done with it. So it's good to let yourself know ahead of time. The point of emergent painting isn't the final result. You're trying to push towards a final result, and this is just kind of the first step there in that journey. Here's an example of something that was an emergent painting that I thought had some potential, and I went and I broke down what kind of visual symbols are going on there, decided what kind of visual style I wanted this character to be in, and then I spent a little bit of time working in another program, a different format, in order to now discover what this emergent painting could become. And I think this is exactly what it's supposed to be. Essentially, this piece was successful in helping me to overcome art block when I couldn't think of any characters on my own to come up with. Just starting with something that was a little bit weird, this portrait, which was a study off of something that I found on a website that I just spent time developing and almost even throwing random elements in, became something usable that I ended up actually really liking. It's inevitable that sometimes when you wake up your internal editor that you're just going to look at it and say, this is garbage. So what do you do when you're unhappy with the results of something? These are some examples of paintings that I was not really that happy with. I spent between 15 minutes to almost an hour on the far right one before I realized that things weren't working and I didn't quite know how to fix what was going on there. And I think this is one of the problems with emergent painting, is that you do sometimes paint yourself into a corner and you don't know how to get out of it. So these are some of the techniques that I found that are very useful at overcoming the problems, the things that are making you unhappy with the results. They're usually a combination of little things that make that difference. It's not that the painting itself is fundamentally broken, or I guess irredeemable is a better word, but rather just a combination of things that will make it work. That once you put those things into place, it will make it work. So first of all, look for the big idea or the big ideas. I've found that a lot of the time I'll make a person or I'll make a portrait, and the portrait itself, even if it's a good portrait, I don't feel like that's really worth going anywhere with. what I'll do is I'll scale back from that portrait, or I'll spend a little bit of time developing outside of it. And while I'm doing that, I'm looking for big ideas. Sometimes I don't know what the big idea is, but I'll just take a motif or something that occurs to me and I'll just draw a shape. In this case, the sort of peacock feathers that came out of this drawing ended up driving the rest of the design. Once I discovered the big idea, the thing that was going to make this different from just a girl that was crouched, that's what made it so that the rest of the piece could kind of follow that big idea once I discovered it. Next, look for big, medium, and small throughout. In this piece, one of the biggest things I was struggling with was trying to figure out how to get big, medium, and small. Everything that I designed early on ended up being even. The more I developed the painting, the more even it was. And so I started pushing the shapes to be really large in some cases and much smaller in other cases, or I'd push the proportions, selecting an area and just moving it upward and then repainting the gap in between. It doesn't take as long as you think it would. It would be nice if Adobe Fresco had a liquify tool or something like that, but even without that, you can work very, very quickly to try out different things because of this sort of smudgy, finger painty way of approaching your painting. And because everything is vague, blending the difference between things is not really that hard. Next, look for alignments and flows. Sometimes things are broken just because your shapes are just all over the place. So look for how those shapes should be connected. What's the big shape that all of the shapes should be connected to? Or if you've got details throughout, are the details related to one another, or are they all just randomly placed? Checking for structure and symmetry is another important thing. It's not really something that you should be thinking about early on, but this is a way of turning on your internal editor to fix problems. Throw a new layer on top and draw over it to figure out where your symmetry problems or where your structural problems are keeping this piece from being as interesting as it ought to be. Then mute the values and just keep exploring. This one is incredibly useful, and on this piece I got to a point where I just could not figure out how to fix it. And so I squashed all those values together, smudged things until it was a little bit hard to read where my original edges were, just enough that I could make decisions on top of it, and then just started pushing it further. And you should never devalue starting over. It's actually very useful, and especially when these paintings might take you 15-20 minutes to get to the point where you realize whether the piece is broken or not. Start over. There's nothing wrong with that. Keep that painting somewhere in your archives. Maybe you'll be able to return to it later and make it into something that's worth doing. But just start a new piece. Sometimes you might be surprised that first piece isn't very good, the second piece is better, and then your third piece is actually something really interesting, just all using the same method. And within 45 minutes, you'll have something that you're excited about. I'm hoping it'll be valuable to do a demo, not where I'm showing how you would finish off a piece, but rather showing the middle, where the thinking happens. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pick a different color. I don't know what I'm going to paint yet, but I'm going to just let a shape emerge. I'm not going to get too specific. In fact, I might even avoid getting specific edges out of this. And then I might go with a lighter value, and I don't think it particularly matters as long as I keep kind of in this muted gray range what I'm actually using as far as a color. We could probably pull a purple in here even, and as long as you're not oversaturating anything, you're gonna get a pretty unified color scheme, and it shouldn't create any problems here. As I mentioned, I still don't really know what I'm doing, and sometimes something specific will start to emerge really early, or even ahead of time I'll think like a crocodile or something like that, and I'll just want to start doing it. Other times I'll just be painting like this and nothing really emerges. Sometimes it'll be something specific that calls out, like I'll see something that feels like a hand or something like that, that will make me want to start diving in a little bit deeper to figure out what's going on. And I think with this one, the part of this image that is just calling out to me is there's this kind of twisted trunk sort of quality, like a tree that is coming out, or a stump or something like that. And so I'm just going to take that idea and we're going to start to roll with it. And you may be thinking to yourself at this point that a stump does not sound like a very exciting thing. That, when you wanted to break your art block, you weren't thinking that a stump was going to be sufficient. But I just want to show you that it can be. And sometimes great ideas just come from the most unexpected places. When I mentioned earlier the idea of trusting the process, this is what I mean. So you don't worry about whether what you're doing is good or bad. By the way, I vary color up frequently. I try to vary color just because it has another emergent quality. So even if we're not getting strong colors across the spectrum, just having color shifts can suggest things that are really valuable. Anyway, so with this tree trunk, I think I'm just trusting that something is going to come out of this exploration. And while I work on this very kind of basic component of it, like what's the shape of this tree trunk or this stump, maybe it's like roots coming out of a stump or something like that, I'm still just trying to keep my mind open to ideas. I'm not thinking about anything critically. You really don't want to be thinking too critically. And so if there's a part of you that starts saying that this image is stupid or that it's not worth working on, then you need to quiet that thing down. Don't listen to that part, and trust what Sam is telling you right now, which is it's going to be worth it. Give us just a minute and something is going to happen here. It's really, really tempting when you're working on this, when something does start to emerge, to start to get into details, and I want to start rendering the specifics of this particular branch or something like that, or want to start peeling things out. And there's nothing wrong with necessarily chasing detail, but if you find yourself moving around doing detail in a bunch of places, then that can be a bad thing, because it moves you out of that emergent mindset and you start just drawing. And I think it's okay to draw when you feel confident with drawing, but not before you know why you're drawing what you're drawing. And I don't feel like we're quite there yet. So there's something about this that is a little bit exciting, just in the shapes and the way it kind of twists across the ground. But I'm also feeling like, even though the shapes are interesting, I don't know that the idea is exciting to me yet. So I'm just going to attempt introducing an idea here. And sometimes it'll just be like a shape. Like, what happens if I were to put something weird here, like a little glowing eyeball or something like that? Or other times it'll just be the shape, and we'll just see what the shape says, and if it suggests anything. And actually, there's something about that little eyeball thing that, as soon as I drew that, it set off a light in my head as well. And I'm thinking, what if this was like a tiny witch's cottage or something like that? And we can introduce a couple of lights within this thing, like it's just maybe like a little miniature witch's apartment complex. And to keep myself still in the mindset of exploration, I'm still going to avoid trying to define anything too much. So even those lights are a thing I'm going to try to avoid treating as if they are too sacred. I want everything to be up for grabs at this point still. In fact, one of the ways to do that is to just go ahead and paint over everything. Not necessarily everything, but if there's something that you feel there needs a little bit more shape definition, or that you need some kind of just something different. I think in this case, it's kind of my gut feeling is that I just felt like I needed something different there. I didn't even know what it was. I'm a believer in following your gut as you do this thing. That your gut, in this case, it's your artistic muse, or that little inner child that you're trying to listen to. And you're not listening to the voices that say whether whatever you're doing is good or bad, but you are listening to the voices that are saying, what if, wouldn't it be cool if, what if we tried this? And I think that type of thing is great. Now you'll notice in this case that I am painting with a little bit of lighting in mind, but you don't necessarily have to have lighting in mind as you paint. It's totally fine for you to do this as a flat process. In fact, a lot of the time when I do character design work, I'll do this very thing, just exploring the idea of shape and how the shapes relate to one another. And I'm thinking a little bit about form, but I'm thinking more about just how does this whole thing come together, and what are the relationships between things. In fact, sometimes if you add light in and you just want to go to shape, what you can do is create a luminosity layer. I'm not necessarily going to use this because I like how the forms are working, but sometimes you'll be adding in value, and what that luminosity layer will do is it'll collapse everything back down to shapes and mostly allow you to ignore the light. Some people have asked when I've done this, is it okay to add a layer? You notice that I'm painting only on the canvas, but adding a layer is totally fine. Just so you know how Adobe Fresco works, as soon as I add that extra layer in here, it does make this brush become very crisp and more drawing-like. Instead of like this smudgy thing that spreads around, I'm now drawing in edges, and then I have to go in with an eraser, make this a soft edge or a eraser that gives me different values. And I can control it, but it just becomes more like a traditional digital painting workflow, which I don't mind, but it's not the advantage of this. So if you feel like you have to do something on a layer, go for it. I don't know that it's the best way to do things in all cases, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with it as long as it helps feed into what you're looking for in the process. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just trying to make it something specific that feels a little bit more witchy. Now that I've got this idea of the witch cottage going on here, I just want to feel out the ideas of these being windows. And what if it were mushrooms that were growing on top to cover those windows and give them that sort of sense of privacy or something like that. Some of you may be thinking as I'm doing this presentation, this is kind of like Bob Ross, you just let things happen. And it is a little bit, but Bob Ross used a back to front painting style, and his paint, for the most part, it would become kind of a more firm part of the canvas, whereas I'm just advocating wet on wet all the way. Just let the wetness of the painting, let that wet paint just hang around as long as you can. You don't ever want to dry this canvas out and just let things smudge around a bit. Alright, there's something good happening here. I don't know if I'm going to necessarily get all structural elements. I think I like the idea of it being slightly ambiguous, if it's like wild witches that live here or if it's civilized witches. So I might have a couple of other elements that suggest the sort of civilized component, but I'm also just going to use the viewer's imagination, just like I mentioned earlier. We're not going to necessarily define everything. I may make it so that at some point a root just kind of goes in and it becomes the ground plane rather than defining exactly where it does and doesn't become that. Maybe if I'm going to introduce a little bit of moss, I don't need to know exactly what is moss and what is bark. It's okay if things start to introduce some of that mossy quality and then don't really fully resolve themselves. Some of the most interesting things that come out of a painting and some of the coolest design decisions have come, as I've worked in my career, have come from those kind of ambiguities. Things that if I were left to myself, I would probably define them, but because I was using a process that forced me not to define them, I actually came up with something better. So we can pull in some more detail here, but I'm already at a place here where I'm feeling pretty good about this, and I don't want to start defining everything too much for you, because this is where the painting bogs down. But I just wanted to demonstrate that because this was really quick. We didn't spend that much time on it, and within that very short time we came up with this compelling story idea. Now that the idea is there, I don't know that this painting is particularly relevant. If it's exciting, go for it. Just spend more time on the painting and developing it and saying, okay, what if this is on a hill and there's this cool bluish grass here, and if you have awesome ideas beyond, go for it, spend that time there. But sometimes what I'll do is I'll just take that idea and now I'll go out, like I said, to drawing mode or something like that, and I'll start exploring the idea because the art block is gone now. It no longer exists. I have an idea and I know what to paint or I know what to draw, and that's the goal. And that's why I think kind of the beginning to middle of the piece is actually the most important part. And I didn't necessarily want to show how to tighten up all the details because that's not as important. The rendering and getting all the lighting beautiful, sorting out the local colors, that's not as important. It's when the idea starts to emerge that you have something valuable. And so that's all we're going to show for the demo, and I hope that's helpful. I'd like to give one more quick demo, and this one I'd like to talk a little bit more about what do you do when you have an idea but it's not a good one, and how do you develop it, but also just the idea of technique and what it means and how you should be using your tools in Adobe Fresco. So in the last demo, I talked a little bit about the idea of witches and maybe these like mini witches. And so the question is, can I just draw? If I have an idea and I know what's going on, is it fine to just say, I think I would just want to draw the witch? Maybe it's like this funny, like gnomish witch that does something. Is there anything wrong with that? And does that hurt anything? I mean, first of all, I think if you can just draw what you want, you don't actually have art block. Your art block makes you stare at that empty canvas and you can't do anything about it. You just find yourself unable to do anything. I guess sometimes you might know something you want to draw, but your inability to draw it might hold you back. But again, in this case, it's just about throwing paint down. So even in that case, I think of the second type of art block, you should be fine just going in with a drawing if that feels good to you. I'm just going to make this throw a broom in there because it's a witch. We'll have to find out later what it's made out of, but you'll notice that this drawing, I know what I'm doing more. I have a better sense of what I want. And so let's make this more of like a mushroom cap sitting on top of this witch's head. And what I want to talk about as I do this is how to use these brushes, how to use the tools here. I know this demo and this presentation isn't really about Adobe Fresco, but I think knowing a little bit about it will actually help you, and specifically the way that I use it. So first of all, the way that the oil brush is used is pretty intuitive. Just it lays down color shortly after you put the brush on canvas, and then it kind of lets go, or it eliminates the color, and so you can see that it just starts to smudge for a while. Sometimes you just want to get less color from the start, and you can pull that down here, just change the flow. And other times you just don't want anything there, and so that you can just push this little touch shortcut and color and just drag color around. I find that I use that one all the time when the texture of the oil paint becomes a little bit too much. Sometimes it just starts to interfere with the things that I want to draw, and that being less than ideal, I like to change it where I can. So I'm going to bring in now a little bit of mushroomy sorts of spots. Reference is also really useful here, so rather than me just diving into something, if I know what I'm looking for, I would normally, and I'm not going to in this case just because I want to work very quickly and I'm mostly showing you technique, but I would normally just pull up a bunch of reference of mushrooms and have other people tried to do tiny witches before, and how did they do it and stuff like that. I am going to, because of the technique here, use muted colors across. I think it's just going to make everything easier, and I still, even though I know the subject matter, I don't know much about the subject matter, and I don't know enough to actually start making decisions with things. And so I'm just going to feel out the shapes of this face, try and get a little bit of pink on that nose and maybe in the cheeks here. And let's sink some eyes in underneath there, and let's make it so this witch feels not like the most intelligent thing in the world, a little bit more gnome-like. And I think I want to make it feel just a little more dangerous. So let's bring some little spot glows into those eyes. So you'll notice I'm doing drawing elements, right? I'm throwing the lips in there, and you wouldn't have to do it that way. If you want to just explore using forms and just say, okay, is it better for the lips and mouth and jaw to be up here, or do I want it to be down low? And I can push and pull to find out what I want. But in this case, I just knew what I wanted, and so I dove in with it again. I wanted to demo this because there's nothing wrong with throwing in drawing elements. With that said, now that I've gone this far into the painting, and this is really, really important, so take notes of this while I am mentioning it. Now that I've got drawn elements in there, now that I've got it defined, it's really hard to move back into the emergent mode. So for the face, I think I kind of had an idea in my head, but I don't actually know what I want that body to be doing. And it's really the only way that I can figure out what that body is doing in a way that makes sense and that's going to work is going to be to go back to the same techniques of the emergent drawing mode. So where are the arms? What do the arms do? How does that stuff work? I am just going to let the smudginess of the brush do the work for me. I'm not going to try to over define any of these things. I might pop in a hand somewhere, maybe explore what could the hand shape or gesture be, and we can start looking at things like, does this little character have some kind of cape or shawl that wraps overhead? And I'm just going to let this stuff emerge from the darkness. In fact, I'm going to keep my colors less saturated because I really don't want them to pop out at this point. I just want this character to be interesting but a little mysterious. And I'm not talking about the emotional response of the character. I'm talking about my development of the character. I don't want to know everything yet. I'm deliberately trying to avoid knowing everything so that I can react to the character a little bit more. Things like, where are the ears and how are they? Maybe it's better to just let it be a soft thing. If you don't really like the gesture of the hand, just blend it in rather than redrawing the hand, because maybe something in that blending process will help you discover what you want. And I think I liked kind of that feeling of like being tucked into something there, and I'm going to go with that. I think that's great. I'm going to leverage that. And I think I liked the idea of making this thing feel tiny, and so we're going to bring up some like oversized elements, like maybe seed pods or whatever that are hanging from this witch's waist. I don't need those things drawn out necessarily, and so we'll let them emerge and maybe even disappear back in under the cloak in some cases. We can let the broom thing emerge. Now I don't know what the broom needs to be at this point, and if I see a shape and a value emerge, that's going to work better. So I'm actually going to pull the colors out and just look at like, what type of shapes do I want? Out of this. And at some point there I may think like, oh, actually that kind of looks like a couple of leaves that have been kind of stripped down. Well, when I discover that, it's valuable to not actually have it be overly defined, because now I can go and find the stems over on the top and put in the detail as I wish without necessarily redrawing everything. And so this is kind of the final lesson that I want to leave with you on this, which is that you need to take advantage of the strengths of this drawing method, which is that you're going to be discovering things, and that you need to be willing at any moment to just kind of strip things out of there. Don't feel like anything is sacred. So things like what the shape of the leaves are, the forms of the leaves, even something like this, right? I just defined that and it's not bad, but maybe I just go over it again with a little bit of a wash brush and not let that all be so cleanly defined, because the definition, it takes with it the criticalness, right? That professor in your head starts to speak up, and you don't necessarily want that. So pay attention to how that stuff works together. Now I'm going to go to a time lapse now just so you can see how this thing comes together. And I'd love you to be able to see kind of where this and where the tree stump where the character lives come from. And again, they both just came as this emergent thing. One, it was emergent from me not knowing anything about what I wanted to draw, and then just something coming out of it and me saying, oh, I kind of like, there's a witchy quality to this and I'm going to run with that. And then the other one, me knowing what character I was going to work with, and then using emergent process to develop that character and find how the proportions, the gesture, the interesting clothing details, all those things work. And either way is a great way to use this process. So I hope that's helpful. In the end, I would probably take this and spend a bit more development outside of this painting process just to push proportions and other things a bit more than what I'm naturally going to be inclined to do while painting on it. And that's totally fine. This is just kind of our first stab, our first iteration in designing. A couple of last notes that are worth bringing up for the sake of avoiding artist block. Some really important things that have helped me and that have helped others that I've worked with. The first one is to get off of social media. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be not on social media at all, but it means you have to strictly manage social media if you're prone to artist block or if you're suffering from it. So for me, what I've had to do is delete Instagram. I just delete the app off my phone, and then when I get to a point where I have something to post, I will install the app, post something, and then delete the app again. In other cases, you may need to have a certain amount of engagement with your followers or other things like that, and that's fine. In those cases where you have to be using more frequently or persistently social media and you recognize that it can be a problem for you, use social media as part of your input. Do it with a sketchbook. If you want your social media to directly benefit your output, do studies of the stuff that you're going to be looking at on there. Second, embrace the things you create. You have to recognize that everything you create is valuable. I just showed you a bunch of paintings that started out as something very underwhelming at best and terrible at worst, and with a little bit of just pushing the colors and the values around, little smudging here and there, every single one of them can be made into something that will inspire future work. I don't know if all of them will necessarily become pieces that I would put in my portfolio, but all of them can become a point of inspiration. Hoard all of your sketches and all of your studies and all of your paintings, all of your little doodles that you do off to the side, because they are part of your total creative output, and they are going to, in many cases, mean something someday. Some of the best pieces I've ever created have come from failed pieces that I was trying to make earlier in my life, and then I opened up that folder later in life and said, do you know what, there's something here, let's make it happen. And then finally, third, remember that your value as a person is not related to the work you're creating. You are worth something, and it doesn't matter whether you're creating something great at this moment. You can be creating persistently and perpetually terrible work and still be an awesome person. So just create and have fun. That's the point. Thank you so much for attending. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that you'll go open up Adobe Fresco, pull out those oil paints, and just start smudging paint around and see what happens. Thank you.